1911 Wedding Portrait Unearthed, and historians tremble when they zoom in on the groom's eyes. Margaret Sullivan had been clearing out her late grandmother's attic in Providence, Rhode Island, for 3 days when she found the old photograph album tucked inside a cedar chest beneath layers of quilts and linens. The album was leather-bound, its pages brittle with age, filled with sepia-toned photographs from the early 20th century. Most of the images showed people Margaret didn't recognize, distant relatives from generations past, their names lost to time. But one photograph stood out, larger than the others, and mounted on thick cardboard backing. It showed a wedding portrait, a young couple posed formally in a photography studio, the bride seated in an elaborate chair wearing a high-necked white lace gown, the groom standing beside her in a dark suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. The photograph was dated on the back in faded ink. Edward and Catherine, married June 1st, 1911, Providence, Rhode Island. Margaret studied the image more closely. The bride looked serene and happy, perhaps 19 or 20 years old. The groom appeared slightly older, maybe 25, with a round, pleasant face and a somewhat stocky build. Not obese, but certainly well-fed, with the soft roundness that suggested comfortable circumstances and good appetite. Both stared seriously at the camera, typical of the era when subjects had to remain motionless during long exposures. Something about the photograph intrigued Margaret. She'd been researching her family history for years, tracing genealogical records and census data, but she'd never found any mention of an Edward in her grandmother's family line. The photograph had clearly been important enough to preserve carefully, mounted prominently in the album, yet no one had ever mentioned these people. She photographed the image with her phone and posted it to a genealogy forum, hoping someone might recognize the names or the photography studio's mark. Within hours, she received a response from Dr. Helen Morrison, a historian at Brown University who specialized in early 20th century New England families. That photograph studio, Blackstone Photography, closed in 1915, Dr. Morrison wrote. They kept meticulous records, many of which are preserved in the Rhode Island Historical Society archives. If you're interested in learning more about Edward and Catherine, I'd be happy to help you research. There's also something unusual about the photograph itself that I'd like to examine more closely. Would you be willing to bring it to my office? Margaret felt a flutter of excitement. She'd stumbled onto something that had caught a professional historian's attention. She carefully removed the photograph from the album, placed it in a protective sleeve, and emailed Dr. Morrison to arrange a meeting. 3 days later, Margaret arrived at Brown University carrying the photograph. Dr. Morrison greeted her warmly and led her to a research room equipped with archival lighting and a high-resolution scanner. Before we start researching the people in this photograph, Helen said, I want to show you what caught my attention. Dr. Morrison placed the photograph under a specialized archival scanner, the kind used to digitize historical documents at extremely high resolution. As the image appeared on her computer screen, she began adjusting the settings, increasing contrast, enhancing detail, compensating for the fading and discoloration that occurred over 114 years. Photography in 1911 was remarkably sophisticated, Helen explained as she worked. Glass plate negatives could capture extraordinary detail. When properly preserved and scanned with modern equipment, we can see things that would have been difficult to notice in the original print. She zoomed in on the groom's face, focusing specifically on his eyes. Margaret leaned forward, studying the enhanced image. Edward's eyes were clearly visible now, every detail sharp and defined. And there, around the outer edge of each iris, was a distinct ring, a grayish-white band separating the colored iris from the white of the eye. Do you see that? Helen asked, pointing to the rings. That's called arcus senilis, also known as corneal arcus. It's a deposit of cholesterol and other lipids that forms around the cornea. Margaret frowned. Is that unusual? In elderly people, no. It's extremely common in people over 60, just a normal part of aging. But look at this man. He's what, mid-20s? Arcus senilis in someone that young is highly unusual. It's called arcus juvenilis when it appears before age 40, and it's almost always a sign of a serious medical condition. Helen pulled up a medical reference on her laptop. When arcus appears in young people, it typically indicates familial hypercholesterolemia, a genetic disorder that causes extremely high cholesterol levels from birth. People with this condition have cholesterol levels 2 to 3 times higher than normal. Without treatment, which didn't exist in 1911, it leads to early heart disease, heart attacks, and premature death. Margaret looked at Edward's image with new eyes. He appeared healthy, happy, slightly plump, but not unhealthy looking. Yet his eyes carried a sign that he was living with a ticking time bomb, a genetic condition that would likely kill him young. The fact that he's a bit overweight actually fits the pattern, Helen continued. People with familial hypercholesterolemia often develop fatty deposits under the skin, and they tend to carry extra weight even with normal diets. What looks like simple prosperity, being well-fed in an era when many people weren't, might actually be a symptom of his condition. She zoomed out to show the full photograph again. This isn't just a wedding portrait. This is medical documentation of a genetic disease, captured accidentally by a photographer who had no idea what he was recording. If we can find out what happened to Edward, how long he lived, what he died from, we might be able to confirm the diagnosis and add to our understanding of how this condition presented before modern medicine. Margaret felt a chill. You're saying we're looking at a man who's probably going to die young, on what should be the happiest day of his life? Possibly, Helen said gently. But let's find out. Let's discover who Edward and Catherine were, what their lives were like, and what this photograph can teach us about medical history and the people who lived through it. Dr. Morrison and Margaret began their research at the Rhode Island Historical Society, searching through records from 1911. They started with marriage licenses registered in Providence in June of that year, looking for an Edward marrying a Catherine. It took 2 hours of searching through handwritten records, but they finally found it. Edward Thomas, age 24, occupation, accountant, married to Catherine Ann, age 19, June 3, 1911, St. Patrick's Church, Providence. Thomas? Margaret said. That was my grandmother's maiden name. Catherine must have been my great-great-aunt, or something similar. That's why the photograph was in her attic. They found Edward and Catherine in the 1910 census, living separately before their marriage. Edward lived in a boarding house and worked as an accountant for a textile mill. Catherine lived with her parents, who ran a small grocery store. Both families appeared to be working-class Irish immigrants who'd achieved modest economic stability. The 1920 census showed Edward and Catherine living in their own home with 2 children, Robert, age 7, and Mary, age 5. Edward's occupation was still listed as accountant, but now he worked for a bank, a step up in status and presumably salary. They'd clearly built a comfortable middle-class life together. But the 1930 census told a different story. Catherine appeared in the records, now listed as a widow, living with her 2 children who were now teenagers. Edward was gone. He died between 1920 and 1930, Helen said, making notes. Probably in his late 30s or early 40s. For a man with no obvious risk factors, no dangerous occupation, living in a period of relative peace and prosperity, dying that young would have been unusual, unless he had a condition like familial hypercholesterolemia. They searched death records for Providence in the 1920s. On their 3rd day of research, Margaret found it. Edward Thomas died February 14, 1927, age 41. Cause of death, acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, at 41 years old, 16 years after his wedding photograph. Helen pulled up the death certificate, which provided more detail. Edward had been at work when he collapsed. A doctor had been summoned but arrived too late. The death was sudden, unexpected. By all accounts, Edward had seemed healthy the day before. This is textbook familial hypercholesterolemia, Helen said, her voice tight with emotion. Young man, no apparent health problems, sudden fatal heart attack in his 40s. The arcus around his eyes in the wedding photograph was warning of exactly this outcome. His body was accumulating cholesterol in his arteries from the day he was born. By his 40s, the coronary arteries would have been severely blocked. One finally closed completely, and he died. Margaret stared at the photograph on Helen's screen, Edward smiling slightly, standing beside his bride, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes showing the telltale rings that predicted his early death. He'd had 16 years of marriage, fathered 2 children, built a career, but his genetics had been slowly killing him the entire time. Did Catherine know? Margaret wondered aloud. Did anyone understand what those rings around his eyes meant? Probably not, Helen said. The connection between corneal arcus and cholesterol wasn't established until the 1960s. In 1911, Edward and Catherine would have had no idea he was living with a death sentence. Dr. Morrison contacted Dr. Richard Chen, a cardiologist at Rhode Island Hospital who specialized in inherited cardiovascular diseases. She explained Edward's case and shared the 1911 photograph showing the distinctive corneal arcus. Richard agreed to meet with them to provide medical context. Familial hypercholesterolemia is one of the most common serious genetic disorders, Richard explained when they gathered in his office. About 1 in 250 people carry a mutation in the genes that regulate cholesterol, usually LDLR, ApoB, or PCSK9. These mutations mean the body can't remove LDL cholesterol from the bloodstream effectively, so it accumulates. He pulled up medical illustrations showing how cholesterol deposits form in arteries. From birth, people with this condition have cholesterol levels of 300, 400, sometimes 500 milligrams per deciliter or higher. Normal is under 200. That cholesterol deposits in arterial walls, forming plaques that narrow the vessels. In the cornea, it forms the arcus, the ring Edward shows in his photograph. Under the skin, it can form fatty deposits called xanthomas. Richard studied Edward's photograph closely. The arcus is prominent in both eyes, visible even in a century-old photograph. That suggests his cholesterol was severely elevated. Combined with the fact that he appears somewhat overweight, which is common in familial hypercholesterolemia because the metabolic disruption affects how the body processes fats, I'd estimate his cholesterol was probably in the 400 to 500 range. And without treatment? Helen asked. In 1911, there was no treatment. Cholesterol wasn't understood as a risk factor for heart disease until the 1950s. Statins weren't developed until the 1980s. Edward lived his entire life with cholesterol levels that were slowly destroying his cardiovascular system, and neither he nor his doctors had any way of knowing or any means to intervene. Richard pulled up survival statistics. Men with untreated familial hypercholesterolemia have about a 50% chance of having a heart attack or dying from heart disease by age 50. Many die in their 30s or 40s, exactly like Edward did. He actually survived longer than many. He made it to 41, married, had children, built a career. Some men with severe cases don't live past 30. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. He looked so healthy in the photograph. A little heavy, but healthy. Happy. He had no idea. That's the insidious nature of genetic conditions like this, Richard said gently. People feel fine. They have no symptoms for years, decades even. Then one day, the accumulated damage reaches a critical point, and the heart fails. It's sudden, unexpected, devastating for the families left behind. He looked at the photograph again. But there's another angle to consider here. If Edward had familial hypercholesterolemia, and if it's genetic, which it is, autosomal dominant, meaning each of his children had a 50% chance of inheriting it, then his descendants might still be carrying and suffering from this condition today. That statement sent Margaret and Helen on a new research path, tracing Edward's descendants to see if the genetic condition had been passed down through the generations. They started with his two children, Robert and Mary, documented in the 1920 census. Robert, Edward's son, appeared in census records through 1950, when he was 37 years old. But the 1960 census showed only his widow and children. Death records revealed Robert had died in 1954 at age 41, exactly the same age his father had been. Cause of death: myocardial infarction, heart attack. Mary, Edward's daughter, had lived longer. The records showed she died in 1982 at age 67. But hospital records that Helen managed to access through the Historical Society showed Mary had suffered her first heart attack at age 45 and had undergone coronary bypass surgery in 1970, one of the early recipients of the procedure. She survived because medicine had advanced, Richard noted when they shared the findings. By 1970, we could perform bypass surgery, give medications to manage heart disease. She lived 22 years after her first heart attack because of medical intervention. But the pattern is clear. She inherited the same condition as her father and brother. They traced further. Robert had 3 children, Mary had 4. Through genealogical records, obituaries, and some detective work, they tracked down what had happened to each of Edward's grandchildren. Of the 7 grandchildren, 3 had died of heart disease before age 55. 2 others had survived heart attacks in their 40s and 50s, but were documented as having high cholesterol in medical records Helen found. One had died in a car accident at age 30, so his cardiovascular fate was unknown. The 7th, a granddaughter, was still alive. She would be 73 now. We're looking at a clear pattern of inherited disease, Richard said. Multiple generations dying young from heart disease, the condition passing from Edward through his children to his grandchildren. This is a textbook familial hypercholesterolemia pedigree. Helen made a decision. We need to find the living descendants. They need to know about this. Modern medicine can test for the genetic mutations, can treat the condition with statins and other medications. If Edward's great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren are carrying this gene, they're at risk right now. But if they're diagnosed and treated, they can live normal lifespans. Margaret nodded. My grandmother was Catherine's niece, which means I'm related by marriage, not blood. I didn't inherit Edward's genes. But there are people out there who did, and they might have no idea they're carrying a genetic time bomb. The research took on new urgency. They weren't just documenting medical history, they were potentially saving lives by uncovering a genetic legacy that had killed across 4 generations. Through genealogy databases, social media, and old-fashioned detective work, Helen and Margaret identified 12 living descendants of Edward Thomas who might have inherited his genetic condition. The closest relative they found was Patricia, Edward's 73-year-old granddaughter, Mary's daughter, living in nearby Warwick, Rhode Island. Margaret called Patricia, explaining who she was and the research they'd been conducting. Patricia was initially skeptical, but became intensely interested when Margaret mentioned the heart disease pattern in the family. "My mother had her first heart attack at 45, Patricia said. "My uncle Robert, he died before I was born, but my mother always said he died young, just like his father. And my brother died 3 years ago. Heart attack. He was only 58, and he'd seemed healthy. The doctor said his cholesterol was through the roof, but he'd only been diagnosed a year earlier." When Margaret explained about familial hypercholesterolemia and showed Patricia the 1911 photograph with the visible corneal arcus, Patricia was silent for a long moment. "I need to get tested, don't I?" she said finally. "And my children, my grandchildren." Dr. Chen arranged for Patricia and her family to receive genetic testing and cardiovascular screening at Rhode Island Hospital. The results came back within 3 weeks. Patricia tested positive for a mutation in the LDLR gene, confirming familial hypercholesterolemia. Her cholesterol level was 387 mmHg. She had moderate coronary artery disease despite never having symptoms. Of Patricia's 3 children, 2 tested positive for the mutation. Of her 7 grandchildren, 4 carried the gene. All of them, including Patricia, were started on high-dose statin therapy and regular cardiovascular monitoring. "You probably saved my life," Patricia told Margaret and Helen when they met in person for the first time. "I had no symptoms. I felt fine. But the scans showed significant blockages. Another few years without treatment, and I might have ended up like my grandfather Edward, dead at 41 from a sudden heart attack." Through Patricia's family connections and the genealogy networks, they reached out to other descendants. Over the following months, 19 relatives agreed to be tested. 11 tested positive for familial hypercholesterolemia. All of them began treatment. The discovery had transformed from historical research into a public health intervention, all because a historian had noticed an unusual detail in a 114-year-old photograph. Dr. Morrison and Dr. Chen collaborated on a paper documenting Edward's case and its implications. Titled Photographic Documentation of Familial Hypercholesterolemia in 1911, a case study in historical medical evidence, the paper was submitted to the Journal of Medical History in early 2025. The paper detailed everything they'd discovered. The 1911 wedding portrait showing clear corneal arcus in a 24-year-old man, Edward's death from myocardial infarction at age 41, the pattern of early cardiovascular deaths across 4 generations of his family, and the successful genetic testing and treatment of living descendants. This case illustrates several important points, the paper's discussion section argued. First, it demonstrates that careful examination of historical photographs can reveal medically significant details that were not recognized at the time. Second, it shows the devastating impact of untreated familial hypercholesterolemia across generations. Third, it provides a powerful example of how historical medical research can have direct clinical impact by identifying at-risk individuals who might otherwise remain undiagnosed until a fatal cardiac event. The paper included the 1911 photograph, with Edward's eyes digitally enhanced to clearly show the corneal arcus. They also included the family pedigree, showing the inheritance pattern across 4 generations, with symbols indicating confirmed genetic testing, heart attacks, and deaths from cardiovascular disease. Peer reviewers praised the work. One wrote, "This is exactly the kind of interdisciplinary research that advances both historical understanding and clinical practice. The authors have turned a wedding portrait into a teaching tool about genetics, cardiovascular disease, and the importance of family medical history." The paper was published in June 2025, exactly 114 years after Edward and Catherine's wedding. It received significant attention in both medical and historical circles. Cardiologists began using the case in teaching, showing Edward's photograph to medical students as an example of how to recognize corneal arcus and why family history matters. Genealogists became more aware of the medical information potentially hidden in old family photographs. Several contacted the research team with their own discoveries. other historical images showing signs of genetic conditions that had gone unrecognized for generations. The story appeared in mainstream media. A wedding photo from 1911 saved lives in 2025, and how historians discovered a genetic time bomb in an old family portrait. The coverage was largely accurate and respectful, focusing on the medical significance while honoring Edward and his descendants. Patricia gave interviews, speaking candidly about learning her family's genetic legacy and the importance of getting tested. "My grandfather Edward didn't have a choice," she said in one interview. "He lived with this condition his whole life without knowing it, and it killed him young. But because researchers noticed something unusual in his wedding photograph, I get to live. My children and grandchildren get to live. That photograph saved us." The publicity around Edward's case led Dr. Chen to organize a public health initiative focused on identifying and treating familial hypercholesterolemia in Rhode Island. He partnered with the state health department to create a screening program, offering free genetic testing to anyone with a family history of early heart disease. Familial hypercholesterolemia is drastically underdiagnosed, Richard explained at the program's launch event. "We estimate that in the United States, about 1.3 million people have this condition, but fewer than 10% know they have it. Most people discover it the same way Edward Thomas did, when they have a heart attack. But it doesn't have to be that way." He displayed a chart showing how treatment changed outcomes. With modern statin therapy, lifestyle modifications, and monitoring, people with familial hypercholesterolemia can live normal lifespans. Their risk of heart attack drops dramatically, but they have to be diagnosed first, and they have to be treated aggressively, starting young. The screening program identified 127 Rhode Island residents with previously undiagnosed familial hypercholesterolemia in its first 6 months. Many were young, in their 20s and 30s, the age Edward had been in his wedding portrait. All of them began treatment, potentially preventing dozens of premature deaths in the coming decades. Educational materials featured Edward's story and photograph. Brochures explaining familial hypercholesterolemia included his wedding portrait, showing the corneal arcus and explaining what it meant. "This man didn't know he had a genetic condition that would kill him young," the brochure text read. "Today, we can identify and treat this condition. If you have a family history of heart disease, especially heart attacks before age 55, talk to your doctor about genetic testing." Medical students at Brown University's Alpert Medical School began using Edward's case in their genetics and cardiology courses. They studied the photograph, learned to recognize corneal arcus, discussed the inheritance pattern in his family, and debated how medical knowledge had evolved since 1911. "Edward's case teaches us humility," one professor told her students. "He walked around with clear physical signs of his condition, visible in his eyes, and no one, including trained physicians, recognized them as medically significant. It makes you wonder what we're missing today. What conditions are we overlooking because we haven't yet made the connections between symptoms and underlying causes?" The photograph also sparked discussions about genetic privacy and family medical history. Some descendants of Edward who tested negative for the mutation expressed relief, but also complicated feelings about having their genetic information documented in medical literature, even with names changed to protect privacy. "It's a balance," Helen Morrison acknowledged in a symposium on medical history ethics. "This research saved lives, that's undeniable. But it also revealed intimate medical information about a family without their initial consent, because the original subjects, Edward and Catherine, couldn't possibly have consented to genetic testing and publication in 2025. We have to navigate these ethical complexities carefully." While much of the attention focused on Edward and his genetic legacy, Helen became interested in Catherine's story, the young bride who'd lost her husband at 41 and raised 2 children alone during the Great Depression. Census and city directory records show that after Edward's death in 1927, Catherine had taken in boarders to make ends meet, renting out rooms in the house Edward had bought during their marriage. She worked as a seamstress, a common occupation for widows of her generation who needed to support themselves and their children. Helen found a particularly poignant detail in a 1928 city directory. Catherine was listed as Catherine Thomas, widow, seamstress, living at the same address where she and Edward had lived together. The notation of widow was standard in directories of that era, but seeing it there, just 1 year after Edward's death, made the loss feel immediate and real. She discovered that Catherine never remarried. Census records from 1930, 1940, and 1950 all showed her living alone or with her adult children, always listed as widow. She lived until 1963, dying at age 71, 36 years after Edward's death. Margaret found a box of letters in her grandmother's attic, correspondence between Catherine and her sister, Margaret's great-grandmother, spanning several decades. The letters revealed Catherine's personality, struggles, and resilience. In a letter from 1928, Catherine wrote, "The house feels too large with just Robert, Mary, and myself. Every room reminds me of Edward, but I cannot afford to move, and I will not give up the home he worked so hard to provide for us. The boarders help with expenses, though it is strange having strangers in what was our private sanctuary." A letter from 1935 during the depths of the Great Depression. "Work is scarce, but I am grateful for my sewing skills. I mend and alter clothing for neighbors, and it provides enough to feed the children. Robert will graduate secondary school next year. Edward would have been so proud. I am determined that both children will have opportunities Edward and I never had." Later letters showed Catherine's pride in her children's accomplishments. Robert becoming an accountant like his father, Mary becoming a teacher, and her joy in her grandchildren. But there were also hints of lasting grief, references to Edward on anniversaries and holidays, expressions of loneliness. In a letter from 1960, 3 years before her death, 70-year-old Catherine wrote, "I have lived twice as long as Edward did. Sometimes I feel guilty for that. Why did I get all these years when he got so few? But then I think of our grandchildren, and I am grateful to have known them. Edward never met any of them. What a loss for all of us." Helen shared these letters with Patricia and the other descendants. Many wept reading their ancestors' words, gaining insight into the woman who had held the family together after Edward's early death. "She never knew why Edward died so young," Patricia said. "She never knew it was genetic, that her own children were at risk. She outlived her son Robert without understanding that he'd inherited the same condition that killed his father. All she knew was loss." The 1911 wedding portrait now hangs in Rhode Island Hospital's Cardiovascular Center, displayed alongside explanatory materials about familial hypercholesterolemia and the importance of genetic screening. Thousands of patients, visitors, and medical professionals pass it each year. The placard reads, "Edward and Catherine Thomas, married June 3, 1911. This photograph, examined 114 years after it was taken, revealed visible signs of familial hypercholesterolemia in Edward's eyes, the corneal arcus visible around his irises. Edward died of a heart attack at age 41 in 1927. Recognition of this genetic condition in the photograph led to testing and treatment of multiple living descendants, preventing further premature deaths in the family. This image reminds us that careful observation can reveal medically significant details even in historical sources, and that understanding family medical history can save lives." Margaret Sullivan donated the original photograph to the Rhode Island Historical Society, where it's preserved in climate-controlled storage and made available for medical education and research. She also created a website documenting Edward and Catherine's story, including photographs, letters, genealogical information, and medical education resources about familial hypercholesterolemia. "Edward deserves to be remembered for more than his genetic condition," Margaret wrote on the site. "He was a husband, father, accountant, community member. He built a life and a family in the 16 years he had after this photograph was taken. His legacy isn't just the gene mutation he passed to his descendants. It's also the love and stability he provided for Catherine and their children during his too short life." Dr. Chen continues to use Edward's case in his advocacy for expanded genetic screening. "If we screened everyone with a family history of early heart disease," he argues, "we could identify most people with familial hypercholesterolemia before they have cardiac events. Edward's story shows us what happens when the condition goes unrecognized and untreated. But his descendants' stories show us what's possible when we identify and treat the condition early. That's the real legacy of this photograph, not just documenting disease, but inspiring prevention." Helen Morrison published a book about medical discoveries in historical photographs, with Edward and Catherine's portrait featured prominently on the cover. The book explores how careful examination of old images can reveal previously unrecognized medical conditions, providing insights into how diseases presented before modern treatments changed their natural history. "Every old photograph is a potential treasure trove of information," Helen writes in the book's introduction. "We look at these images and see fashion, furniture, social customs. But if we look more carefully, we can see health, disease, genetic conditions, environmental exposures, a whole dimension of human experience that the photographers never intended to capture, but that remains visible if we know how to look." On June 3, 2026, exactly 115 years after Edward and Catherine's wedding, Patricia and her family gathered at Rhode Island Hospital for a small ceremony. They stood before the photograph, 3 generations of Edward's descendants, all tested, all treated if necessary, all living with the knowledge and tools that Edward never had. Patricia placed her hand on the frame, touching the glass that protected her grandfather's image. "Thank you," she whispered to the young man in the photograph, to the groom with the slight smile and the telltale rings around his eyes. "Thank you for being documented, for being preserved, for being seen. You saved us without knowing it. Your wedding portrait became our warning and our salvation." Edward stares out from 1911, frozen at 24 years old, standing beside his bride, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes showing the genetic signature that would kill him, but that would also, more than a century later, save the lives of descendants he never met. The photograph is no longer just a wedding portrait. It's a bridge across time, connecting past suffering to present prevention, turning historical tragedy into contemporary hope, proving that sometimes the most important medical discoveries are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was always there.